All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Gribble. I'm a program manager at the Maryland Healthcare Commission, also known as MHCC. Thank you for joining today's non-controlled prescription drugs workgroup meeting. It looks like we have quite a few people joining us today. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the MHCC website. We do have a full agenda. Instead of taking attendance, everyone's here by reading off names. We are just going to track who's logged in and who's registered for the Zoom meeting. And I don't believe we have anyone calling us, so we have everyone's name. We should be all set. If you have any technical issues during today's call, please email Justine Springer. Her email address was provided to participants on Friday. During today's presentation, please hold all of your questions until after the presentations. We have a full agenda, and as I said, many people on the call, and if we're not able to get to questions, we will address it either in a follow-up email or on a follow-up call after this. All right, well, to kick us off today, I'd like to welcome Ben Steffen, MHCC's Executive Director, and David Sharp, the Director for MHCC Center for Health Information Technology. Ben, are you with us?
I can hear you. Thank you very much, Anna. I want to welcome everyone on the call today. I see we have an impressive group of people. As most of you know, the effort to incorporate non-controlled drugs into applications for care management, clinical support has been an effort that's gone on for several years. In 2022, we were successful in getting legislation adopted. In the interim, since passage of the legislation, we've spoken with a number of different groups regarding establishing this initiative. And this is the first formal meeting of everyone to talk about the ideas that different stakeholders have, as well as to hear efforts in Nebraska, which we've seen as an important guidepost in moving forward. Before I pass this on to David, I want to recognize the work of the staff here at MHCC in putting this work together, and look forward to hearing all of you today and in the following meetings over the next few months. So welcome, and David, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. I echo the comments from our executive director, and in the interest of time today, I'm going to hand it right back to Anna, and let's get things started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben and David. So I have up on the slide, if you can see the screen, just an overview of the agenda. And then before we jump into presentations, I'd like to start off today's meeting with some background on how we got to today into this work group. So during the 2018 legislative session, House Bill 115 required the Commission to convene a work conduct health IT policy study to assess the benefits and feasibility of developing an electronic system for healthcare providers to access patient prescription medication history. The MHCC submitted a report in 2019 to the Governor and General Assembly detailing findings and recommendations from the study. So then in 2022, during the legislative session, Chapter 296 passed, and this chapter requires dispensers to provide non-controlled or non-CDS dispense data to the state designated exchange by electronic means without unduly increasing the workload or expense on dispensers, and in a manner that minimizes burden and duplication. So Chapter 296 requires the state designated exchange to make available the dispense data for purposes of patient treatment and care coordination. Chapter 296 also allows the state to provide data for public health purposes of improving health equity and through access to prescription medication. All right, so that leads us to today's meeting in the work group. Today's meeting is intended to build awareness of technical and policy lessons learned from CDS reporting. As Ben said, we will hear from Nebraska as they've been implementing a non-CDS reporting system for a while. And before that, we will hear from someone from Maryland to discuss lessons learned from the reporting of data to the Maryland PDMP. So after those presentations, we will open the meeting for discussion. We really look forward to hearing from workgroup participants on what they view are leading considerations in implementing Chapter 296. Through input solicited from stakeholders during workgroup calls, the Commission aims to identify the technical and policy considerations for the collection and display of non-CDS dispense data, as well as discuss an implementation strategy which leverages existing infrastructure. So again, please hold your questions until after the presentations, and then we'll have a time to hear from stakeholders. All right, our first presentation today, we're going to hear from Michael Baer. Michael, are you on the call with us?
Yes, can you hear me, Anna?
So thanks so much. So real quick, the Maryland PDMP started collecting dispense data for Schedule 2 through 5 medications dispensed into Maryland in 2013. And Michael is with us today to share lessons learned from implementing the PDMP in Maryland. So, all right, Michael, we're ready to hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And I don't have any slides to share, but Anna had asked me to just give some basic information about our experience, in the early days of setting up the PDMP in Maryland, and some lessons learned that may be relevant to your decision-making processes as it relates to the non-controlled substance reporting processes. And so for those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Michael Baer. I'm with the Maryland Department of Health Behavioral Health Administration. In my current role, I work on a few different projects related to grants management, some data analysis projects looking at overdose risk factors in the state. But about 10 years or so, a little more than 10 years ago, when I came to the department, my first job was as the first manager for the prescription drug monitoring program, and in getting that project set up after the legislation passed in 2011. And just some basic background about our approach back then to setting up a PDMP. First thing was that we were far from the first state to implement one of these programs. We were probably more towards the tail end of states setting up a PDMP. And one thing that was clear from both the legislature, from many of the stakeholder organizations at the time, was that they wanted Maryland's program to have a public health and clinical focus, because as many PDMPs had been historically in other states, there had been more of a controlled substance regulatory focus or a law enforcement focus associated with those programs. So we started Maryland's program from the standpoint of really trying to focus primarily on setting up the program as a useful tool for clinicians, first and foremost, in improving the care of patients, even though the program did also have similar aspects to other states, providing access to data under subpoena or administrative subpoena by law enforcement, licensing boards, and others. So, we were lucky at the outset of doing our work in Maryland that we had the opportunity to work with CRISP as the state designated health information exchange. I think, CRISP was just getting started from an operational perspective around that time. And, we were able to basically come to an agreement where CRISP basically was set up to provide basically the primary IT services provider for setting up the PDMP for the state. And we were able ultimately to manage an approach that where we got the best benefits out of working with CRISP was, we wanted the controlled substance dispensing data to be integrated into the CRISP portal, and there alongside other health information that we knew that the clinical users of CRISP were going to want and have access to. So basically create more of a complete health record available through CRISP for clinicians. But the approach we took was also able to leverage other products from existing vendors that work in the PDMP space in other states, and to essentially segregate out some of those components of the PDMP that were not health related, including some of the things I mentioned earlier, like access by licensing boards, regulators, law enforcement, just as tools that we manage from the state level. So that was a good arrangement at the end of the day. I think it made everyone much more comfortable in terms of Chris' role in the program, which was, again, solely focused on the clinical use case. And one thing about our early discussions about the infrastructure of the PDMP that may be relevant to discussions now is that the PDMP law in Maryland that established a program had given the department the direction that the infrastructure needed to basically place the least burden as possible on dispensers when it came to any new processes that were going to be set up for reporting controlled substance information. And so we really, I think, looked closely at our available options. I think David Sharp will probably remember some of this, and we had a good team back then, looking at all of our options. And at the time, there were, I think, two major vendors nationally that had contracts with most states to run PDMPs, and a handful of smaller companies that were doing this in other states. And they had systems that basically where dispensers would report directly to them using file upload processes and an array of different reporting processes to essentially meet the different types of dispensers where they were in terms of their their IT capacity, what would fit best with their clinical workflows. So whether we're talking about pharmacies, national chains, independents, small brick and mortar, mail-in, dispensing practitioners, these companies had a different set of reporting tools that could be implemented, to cater to those different audiences. And so that was sort of the standard approach that we saw around the country. But we also wanted to look at, especially from our standpoint and working with our state health information exchange, other processes that might leverage the billing workflows from pharmacies, and through some of the companies and organizations that are involved with claims processing between dispensers and insurers. So we wanted to look at that as well, and through our outreach to the different companies and our solicitation of proposals, we did get some proposals that include the potential to leverage the existing billing and claims data flows from dispensers to payers as the source of the data, rather than using the more direct approach that had been in place with other state PDMPs of dispensers reporting to the vendor. I think ultimately we decided to not take the approach of doing, I guess, what would have been pretty novel at the time of leveraging the billing workflows. There were, and again, this was a long time ago, so I'm sort of working from memory here, but a lot of there were a lot of complications to that. I mean, one was the data standard. I think it's NCPDP in the billing realm. State PDMPs and the vendors operate off a different data standard. There seemed to be a lot of logistical issues related to where the data flows originate in pharmacy systems versus point of sale software that would need to be worked out and reconciled to make those data feeds workable from a PDMP compliance standpoint. And I know from my perspective as a state official at the time responsible for implementing the program, we had a very small team at MDH that was responsible for implementing all aspects of the PDMP. And we knew that one thing that was going to be important for the operations of the program was the quality and accuracy of the information that gets reported in and that is ultimately accessed by clinicians and others who use it for decision-making purposes. And so we knew that initially we were going to have a difficult time of really getting a quality assurance process for that data up and running. We're going to have to rely heavily on our vendors and the set of tools that they brought to the table to allow us to address that. And we felt that, I think, going with the existing types of processes that were being used by PDMP vendors out there would at least help us avoid some of the additional challenges that might have come from a less tested or proven approach on the claims end of things. So at the end of the day, we did, go with in this case, a subcontractor that really focused on and used the existing type of reporting processes that had been in place in other states. And we think that worked out well in the end. I mean, in years after, the PDMP as a program within MDH was able to bring on additional resources to work on the data quality assurance piece. But I think that at least saved us that challenge of having to address those more complicated issues up front. So I think that was one of the major things, and there are probably others I could bring up. I know we're short for time today, so I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing that history. Could you speak a little bit to when the PDMP started collecting data from pharmacies? Did you work with a group of pilot pharmacies, and what was that communication like to the dispensers in the state?
I mean, we had different methods of communication. One thing we benefited from was an advisory board that was mandated by statute that had representation from all the major stakeholder groups. We had great active membership on that board. I think a couple of people who may be on the call today. And that was essential in giving us useful information about what would be workable and what might be a challenge, and then also getting the word out. We also did things like mass communication, faxing information to pharmacies. We put together an entire manual that was heavily detailed that went out in different ways, presentations to organizations. We used many different methods of doing this. In terms of a phase-in approach, I can't remember the details of that, so I don't want to give misleading information, but I think we did phase things in somewhat. I could go back into my records and look for some of that if you all are really interested in the rollout details.
That's helpful. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. All right, our next presentation today is from Kevin Borcher. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today from the Think Health Conference. I know you're busy with that conference, and I appreciate you taking time out to share with us Nebraska's PDMP and your collection of non-CDS dispense data. So
No,
Kevin, are you with us? Go ahead.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
And yes, thanks.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me today. As some of you probably remember, in 2018, I was invited to the commission's meetings on doing something very similar, and I was re-invited again. So I didn't do everything wrong at that time, but I have some more information, and I didn't want to go into a lot of detail. I could talk for hours and hours, but really keeping this just to a few short minutes on this, talking how PDMPs have been evolving, where their initial focus has always been on drug abuse, diversion, fraud. And over the years, they've been evolving and expanding more towards a public health, patient care, patient safety system. Last year, the National Association for State-Controlled Substances Authorities updated their Model PMP Act. And in that, the purpose of it, they state, is to improve patient care and looking at public health as well. Nebraska's PDMP has always been similar to that, where we focus on improving patient care for law enforcement, not so much, but more on the diversion, the fraud, and allowing providers to have access to more information to make better informed decisions. When we originally had our legislation passed in 2016, we had some challenges because it said in 2017, Nebraska shall have dispensers, pharmacies report controlled substances, and beginning January 1, 2018, all prescriptions are to be reported. We did have some pushback, mainly from some associations, vendors, pharmacies, because it was that fear of the unknown. No one had ever done this before. And so what I like to do is focus on what I call the 3 C's: communication, collaboration, and cooperation. And we had to do this because it was in statute. So we focus on getting stakeholder groups together across the healthcare spectrum. We had some physicians, we had the Medical Association, Pharmacy Association, we had pharmacies, both large chains and some smaller pharmacies as well, the independents, and anyone who is really going to be involved with this, and said, we're going to have to do this. Let's figure out how. It's not a matter, and some of the vendors on the call will tell you, it's not necessarily a matter of flipping a switch and having all prescriptions just flow through a gateway. Some systems have been designed like that, others not so much. So it's going to be a little bit of work, but we had a lot of communication going out saying, you know, we did it early on in 2017 saying, be prepared, this is coming. In 2018, we did a lot of reach out, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails. We held those stakeholder meetings to look at the gotchas, the what are we missing, what don't we know, because we didn't know what we didn't know at the time. And we worked through those. It took months, but we still did work through those. And I think having that collaboration of bringing all the stakeholders together at the table to figure out what we need to look at. What about veterinarians? What about the VA? What about long-term care, home health, home infusion, you know, all the different types of pharmacies that Nebraska had, that Maryland probably has some very similar in that respect. And we identified who all of the pharmacies were, who all of the pharmacy software vendors were. We had a lot of reach out directly to them, making sure they were aware, try to get to any stakeholders so that they could spread the word. And then we worked with them on testing. And that took, somewhere around 3 to 6 months of testing, making sure we could do that in a test environment, making sure all the data was indeed flowing. And then we actually had some of the data flowing as early as late November 2017. So we tried to onboard everyone for all prescriptions through the month of December, which everyone knows is not a good month for anything IT focused. But we did get that and had the majority of it done by January of 2018. We did have some stragglers, some that either didn't get the message, weren't sure what to do, and we did a lot of hand-holding. It took internal resources from, at the time we were knee-high, now Sync Health in the HIE, and we had to ramp up support a little bit, but we worked with them and we got them knocked out as quickly as possible, trying to understand that. We had been on ASAP version 4.2a. We still are. We're considering ASAP 4.2b, but knowing that there's going to be a new ASAP version coming out in probably 2024, we may hold off for that version. We're waiting to see where that goes. But that's sort of where we're at. We did find that, and we do get the questions, how much data do we have? And in knowing that we're a smaller state, about 1.9 million people, we had around 3.5 million dispensed prescriptions through our system in 2017 with controlled substances only. In 2018, we saw that increase between 9 and 10-fold, up to 32 to 34 million per year. So there's definitely an increase. Database sizing needs to be done, but that's just technical. Honestly, it's small potatoes anymore in this world. And we've been using the same PDMP vendor that Maryland does now for, when did we go live? October of 2020. So it's been just under 2 years now. And we've had very few problems with it. So it's a little bit of work up front, but it pays off in the end. And it provides that information to the clinicians that they so desperately need to have that comprehensive medication history available. That's just a summary. I can go into a lot more detail, but Anna, for the sake of time, I'll end there.
Kevin, I have a few follow-up questions for you, just real quick. Thank you for sharing us a great summary of what's happening in Nebraska. Can you share a little bit more about what real-time access looks like in Nebraska to data and how the impact of a delay has in delivering care?
Sure. So in the Support Act in 2018, there was a section in the Section 5042 Medicaid Partnership Act, which says that information should be made available as close to real time as possible. And we leveraged the Support Act funding at the time, and we had our statute modified where it just says dispenser shall report at least daily. So between funding federally and our statute opened up, we were able to provide an opportunity for any pharmacies who wished voluntarily to report in as real time as possible. And usually many already did. If they had point of sale, most of them were already available to do that. There were some where we had funding, once again, and we were able to pay for that software, the point of sale software, the interface to their pharmacy management system. And we currently have roughly about 60 pharmacies. We have over 1,000, about 500 in state, and then around 600 plus mail order pharmacies. And we were focusing, of course, on the Nebraska community pharmacies in state. So we have about 60 out of the 500 that are doing that on a voluntary basis. We've been reaching out to, and most of those are the smaller ones, the independents or smaller chains. The larger chains we did reach out to, but it wasn't on their roadmap at the time. They already have everything set by the time Support Act funding was ended. So we weren't able to leverage that, but we're encouraging anyone that wants to do it. And the systems are capable of doing that. Oklahoma requires it within 5 minutes of the prescription being sold. Missouri, in their PDMP legislation, will allow it in 2023 and require it in 2024. The technical capabilities are there. It's just leveraging those and working with the software vendors.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned the vendor that you work with. What were the drivers for selecting a vendor in Nebraska?
We wanted someone that had a strong technical background, someone that we had some good references from. And actually, we work closely with Maryland. Maryland started with our software vendor, as same as yours, NIC, and we followed suit. We just expanded to all prescriptions before you. And we were able to leverage some capabilities and work with our vendor to be able to make it work for not only the legacy system of CDS, but also how can we take advantage of all prescriptions to make it work for the clinicians for a full medication history for MedRec.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. All right. Before we open it up for discussion and to have some follow-up questions for the other stakeholders on the call, I wanted to share a little bit of background about the current landscape of reporting of CDS data in Maryland. So in Maryland, and we were able to work with the PDMP staff, so I think the Maryland PDMP staff and someone on the call, and thank you so much for helping us pull some of these numbers. But in Maryland, there were 1,945 dispensers who reported CDS dispense data to the PDMP, and that's every 24 hours. And then recently, we were able to find that there were, of the 46,864, so about 47,000 dispenses reported to the PDMP in fiscal year 22. There were several that were not controlled substances. And so of those 1,945 dispensers who report some amount of CDS dispenses, there were 775 dispensers, which account for 40% of the dispensers in Maryland who reported some amount of non-CDS data. So just real quick, I think, I may have stumbled over that a little bit, but just so everyone knows, Maryland collects on around 7 million dispenses every year to the PDMP. And we were able to identify that there were almost 2,000 dispensers who reported CDS data, and 775 of them unique dispensers who reported some amount of non-CDS data to the PDMP. So this tells us, kind of given the background, that there are some dispensers who are reporting some amount of non-CDS data already to the PDMP, which is an interesting finding for us. And we also know, in talking with many of you on the call in preparation for today, that there are many states who collect drugs of concern that are not necessarily controlled substances. It's about 31 states, and that's also, there's 26 states who collect naloxone data, which is not a CDS dispense, into their PDMPs. All right, so I think we're really looking forward to hearing from those others on the call today, the dispensers we have. So considering Michael and Kevin's presentations and the current reporting of dispense data in Maryland, what are some of the key technical and timing considerations that we should consider in the collection of non-CDS data? And if you'd like to speak, please use your hand function. David, why don't you kick us off? Thanks.
Sure. Good afternoon again, everyone. And Kevin and Michael, thank you for those great sort of look backs in the mirror. My initial question is for Kevin, and I may have missed this, but you made an interesting point, because some of what we hear about from providers about the use of non-CDS information, and somewhat for the CDS, is its rapid availability. Can you clarify or talk a little bit more about if you didn't get to within a 5-minute submission of that transaction, or the availability of that transaction, if you're not there, what's the plans for getting there, and what are the technical hurdles that face both NIC as well as the PLS systems for implementing that?
Sure. So technically, there's virtually nothing on the RPDMP vendor NIC that they need to do. They have an SFTP site set up that can pull in that data. They use the standard ASAP format, and there might be some, they have, and this is where I know enough to be dangerous and can't really speak to it, WSDL, I believe it is, which helps to facilitate that transmission of data. But they typically can send, as soon as it hits the point of sale system through the interface to the pharmacy management software, and sends to the PDMP in near real time. Technically, it's very able to be done. The volume is not an issue. We did a lot of testing beforehand with our relatively small systems, but we do get plenty of data in the system in real time. Technically, there's really nothing else in database sizing that needs to be done. You're still getting 34 million records per year, roughly about 90,000 per day. It's just you get them in the large batches of 200 to 20,000, depending on the pharmacy system. Or are you getting more smaller files? And so all that's capable. I think a lot of it is working with the pharmacies to identify, get a survey out. And we tried to survey as much as we could where who did and did not have point of sale, and see if they were interested in doing that. Once again, I had mentioned mainly it was the larger chains because we were limited on time, that they were not able to participate in getting that real-time submissions because of the roadmap within their software. But technically, it's capable of being done. It's being done in Oklahoma, so there's no reason why it can't get done elsewhere. Probably going to depend to vendor to vendor.
Understood. And then my next question, and then I'll defer to some others for the moment, is on the ASAP standard. It's the implementation guide is quite rich in terms of options for both for situational, of course, they're the required. How did you all decide on, in addition to the required reporting elements, the situational? And I say that because it seems like some of what could be the most richest information in terms of knowledge base for providers is in the situational header or categories of the implementation guide. So how did you ultimately decide on, what the snapshot looked like?
Well, we started with the minimum of what was in statute. And we also did quite a bit of reach out to the software vendors to say, we understand this is in statute, you need to send these, but we voluntarily requested them to send everything. And the majority of them have been able to do that. I'm not sure if that's easier for them or not. It's probably vendor dependent, but we've been tracking how much we're getting on those other fields. And so we allow them and encourage them to be sent. And we had a survey through Nebraska DHHS last May on what the clinicians wanted, what enhancements. And there were two pieces within ASAP that they really wanted. They wanted the directions or the SIG, and they wanted the diagnosis or the ICD-10 code. Those were the two largest requests we were hearing. The directions are relatively easy to be sent from the vendors, although a lot of it is not clean because it's reported in different ways. ICD-10 code, we have limited success because you're really dependent a lot upon either the prescriber sending that or the pharmacy if they're able to obtain that in a timely fashion. So we have a small number, probably about 12 or 13% voluntarily reporting ICD-10 code. And we have a little over 55% of software vendors and pharmacies reporting the SIG, the directions.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I think Jacob from Walmart, would you like to share?
Yes, thanks, Anna. I want to call out that when Nebraska set this up, they did a really good job at thinking it through, and I want to commend you, Anna, for Maryland's perspective to having this call. It's not as simple as flipping the switch, going from control to all inclusive, and some things you might want to consider is when you look at how you submit through the ASAP methods. How you currently have the fields flagged, meaning if they're required or if they're optional, if they're situational, that's going to be imperative to be reviewed when you start looking at submitting non-controlled drugs to the PDMP. And what I mean by that is if you're going to start receiving amoxicillin prescription, you definitely don't want to make DEA number a required element field. Another thing to consider is if you're going to be receiving amoxicillin prescriptions, you're not going to necessarily require a pickup person to present a photo ID. So you're not going to have that ID number as well. So thinking through that is going to be very important as you turn it on. I know we created a system where we were able to flag different things on and off, but I think I spoke to you, Anna, about this. Another thing to consider, and I'm not sure if we've experienced this with Nebraska or not, but whenever there's a new NDC to market, I know in some processors, when we try to submit that claim to the processor, submit that record to the processor, they don't recognize the NDC. So they flag it and they kick it out because they haven't added it to their database yet. Something to consider is how you actually receive the records as well. And what I mean by that is in some processors, when we send a batch file, say it contains 70 prescriptions from this store, if one line item, one record on that file is incorrect, it'll kick out the whole batch file. So one thing to consider is how you receive that information from on the processor level to one, maybe not kick out the whole file, but maybe just that line item. That way you're receiving a majority, and then we can go in and edit that one line item. This is especially useful when we have NDC matters bubble up. But this is all just from a technical perspective, and I'll be glad to partner with you and share some experience that we saw in other parts of the country when we started adding drugs of concern. Nebraska, when we started turning on non-CDS drugs there. But there are some technical things we would definitely need to kind of earmark to prevent patient impact.
Could I speak to that? Because Jacob brings up a couple of very valid points. And we've worked with our vendor, we being Nebraska and Maryland, to be able to essentially handle those situations. So for Nebraska, if the logic is developed, so if a controlled substance require DEA, if non-controlled, then require DEA or NPI. And since the Support Act really is looking for NPI and they don't say it must be an NPI, most providers do have an NPI number. So we do that. And for the unknown drugs, yes, there are a lot, and we're going through a process right now to identify all of the unknowns that we've found in the system, whether it's, let's say, a pharmacy-specific brand of ibuprofen or acetaminophen. Those aren't always in there. There are some either obsolete or brand new drugs that sometimes aren't there. And our vendors created what we call a customized NDC database. So if we find those, first of all, it flags those to the pharmacy or the vendor as a warning, so it doesn't error out. And this is functionality that's state specific. So you can say if the NDC is invalid, make it an error. If it's just not found, put it as a warning so that prescription will be available, but to the clinician, it'll say details not available. And what we're doing is we're building up this customized database with all of those. We're working with some of the wholesalers to get some lists, working with some pharmacies, populate that. So then those missing NDCs will be enriched and have the information that the clinicians want. So you bring up a great point, Jacob. We've addressed or are addressing some of that right now.
Absolutely. I don't think I've run into that issue in Nebraska. I was just calling it out for future iterations. No, but I think we're rolling along fine in Nebraska. So, but I definitely appreciate that.
Good.
Thank you both. I think we'll go from David and then to Dan.
Why don't I defer to Dr. Morheim and then I'll come back. How's that?
Sounds good. Thank you. Dr. Morheim?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Anna and MHIC for hosting this. I just want to give a little history for all who don't know. I think David Sharp and I first worked on this legislation. I'm an ER doctor. I was in the legislature for 20 years, maybe in 2015 or 2016, I think. And then I was the lead sponsor of House Bill 115 that was referenced. And I'm going to speak on behalf of clinicians, which, and Michael Baer, thank you, Michael. I wrote down, he said, ultimately used by clinicians. I think we need to keep that in mind. And Kevin, thank you, also mentioned improving patient care and public health. I thought I'd recommend that everybody go to the actual bill in the Maryland General Assembly, House Bill 1127, and read the testimony, especially mine, but also Ben Steffens. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Medication errors among the most common causes of morbidity and mortality in hospitals, particularly holds true for emergency departments. I was at Franklin Square for 13 years and Sinai since 1995, which are at least half, probably more like 80–90% of hospital admissions in the nation, in the state, come from through ERs. Studies find that inaccuracies in medication histories account for up to 50 to 70% of admitted patients, and over one quarter of these errors are attributable to incomplete information at the time. And then it goes on to adverse drug events, and this is Ben Steffens' testimony, inappropriate drug therapy. It's about 5 to 10% of hospital admissions are medication related, and it's more complicated now. Way back when I was a young doctor, there were two medicines for diabetes, insulin and metformin. You had a pill or a shot. It was easy to distinguish, but now there's dozens, and new immunologics and all these other medicines. You have to know what they are. Aging population, people are taking many medicines. And so the thing that I want to emphasize is all this discussion is really behind the scenes for the thousands of clinicians who are going to be logging onto their computers at work and looking at a screen and looking at a patient. And what they need to have confidence in is the following. It has to be accurate, the correct name. I bet there's quite a few David Sharps running around the country. There's only one David Sharp at MHIC. We have to make sure we have the right name. And I've struggled with that clinically at times. It has to be timely and as near real time as possible, which actually should be 5 minutes or less. I know that it can be done for purposes of billing in milliseconds, but you can't have things as 1 day or 1 business day because that could be a long time. And it has to be national, not just regional. People travel. And when it's just regional, that's just naive thinking. People are flying across the country, whether it's, in ways that are inappropriate, trying to, and as an ER doctor on front lines in the urban areas, and even rural areas, people know how to scan and run the system. And so you have to have it be real time, not something like 1 business day, which on a Friday before a 3-day weekend can be a Tuesday. And people seeking medications inappropriately know that. But likewise, you want it because people may get an amoxicillin in California and then come, land and come to the emergency room with a rash. And what medicine is it? So you do need to know all those other medicines. So I just want to emphasize that we have to have the confidence that it's national. People travel, especially in a cookie cutter state like Maryland. Maybe it doesn't come up so much in Nebraska, but we're surrounded by many other states and a drive-through for many others. It has to be timely, and it has to, and meaning within milliseconds, preferably, or certainly under 5 minutes, and it has to be accurate. And if we have doubts, look, I'm grateful for any information I can get, any shred of information in the emergency room. We spend a lot of time, patient comes in, running the computer, try to figure out who this person is and what do we know about them. And, we have to be skeptical and prudent, but it really, when it rolls out to the many clinicians, pharmacists, doctors, nurse practitioners, physicians, assistants, and so on, they really want to know that it's all working and that it meets these standards. And anything less will create doubt. And so I appreciate all the background discussion, but in the end, let's remember who's actually going to be using this. And I've always tried to champion the folks that are looking at a computer screen and looking at a patient and have a few seconds to a few minutes to a half hour to make a decision. They want to know that it's timely, accurate, and national. Thanks. And Kevin, I wanted to, and I did put a chat in the question for both Kevin and about the vendor, Nick, which I think is something else now. So if you could just background that for a second for me and maybe for others.
I can start and then Michael can fill in. NIC started, I want to say it was around 2018-ish, and they've been our vendor for a little less than Maryland. And since then, they've been acquired by Tyler Technologies from Texas. It's a very large corporation, so they have a lot of backing behind them too. NIC does have 3 states that they do support their PDMP for, and then they've actually recently expanded into Canada. I believe it's New Brunswick.
Add one other thing in that regard, because among my duties in the General Assembly was chairman of the subcommittee that dealt with procurement. So I dealt with a lot of procurement law, transparent bidding, and open bids on contracts. So whatever we do in Maryland, however we go about this, I hope that it is an open, transparent process for any and all vendors to participate. And I think that's going to be really important for this to have the integrity that you want it to have.
Thank you, Dr. Morheim. I do think part of the question was specific for Michael. I don't know, Michael, I know it's been a few years if you remember who you worked with previously.
Oh, yes, and I see Dr. Morheim's question in the chat now. So when I was saying subcontractor, just going to go back to the original approach to this in Maryland. We wanted to fund CRISP to be responsible for the entire suite of IT services at that time needed to support the PDMP, and CRISP is very adept at integrating the services of different vendors together into a more complete system. So we, the department, funded CRISP directly, and then I use the term subcontractor because they then brought in additional subcontractors from our standpoint to perform some of those services. The main one for the PDFP was called HID at the time. They provided the interface with the dispensers and handled the data collection, handled some other processes for us. And I know that they were then acquired by, I believe, Apris, and in the years since then, since I haven't been involved with the program, it's changed. I believe NIC is the current, I guess, technically subcontractor from the department standpoint that is performing those services.
Thank you. So let me just respond very quickly, Anna. From my point of view, it's fine if it goes through CRISP. That's what I'm used to looking at clinically. What I want to see is another tab there that says medications. Now, how CRISP chooses to get that flow of information is a key question, and it ought to be an open, transparent, competitive process, not CRISP deciding all by itself that it's going to contract with this or that. CRISP has improved a lot since it started, and we've all grown to rely on it, and we'd like it to be at least I've talked to a lot of clinicians about this. This is not just my opinion. I'm representing a lot of folks who are doing the care right now while we're talking here. They want it in the CRISP system, and they want it to be accurate, timely, and national. And anything less than that will not be sufficient. And how CRISP gets it is something that we ought to be knowing, and ought to be a transparent or competitive, open process.
We have a few more minutes left, and before we jump to our last discussion, I see we have colleagues from Wegmans who are on the line who also have their hands raised. So Mike, if you wanted to start first.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm sure Karen has more of the IT questions, and it's not too much. I appreciate the view from the clinician side. That was very valuable. Really appreciative. I guess I had more of a kind of a curiosity question with prescriptions that get mailed in to states, and I'll say from stores into other pharmacies. Most of the time they have to be licensed, and I think that would be a hard piece to leverage to get that information into the system. We'll figure all that stuff out, I'm sure. But on top of that, are we going to be responsible for our data as it goes in? If there's any issues to be corrected daily as well? I can see, from our pharmacies, 12 to 1,500 per. You're looking at about 10,000 submissions. I'd hate to have to throw in another resource to try to fix anything that may not be on the cusp of CRISP, understanding if we have to fix an NDC or an MPI or something along those lines. So appreciate the response. Thanks.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Thank you for that comment, Mike, about the dispensers, and it goes to, I think, what Jacob was saying about flexibility and reporting, and that's something we would definitely like to work with the dispensers and talking through what are those options and what works best for everybody. And I didn't know, Karen, go ahead.
Just a quick comment about errors. For Nebraska, what we've seen in reality is that we're seeing about a 0.2% error rate. Now, if you have 10,000 prescriptions come through, yeah, that can add up. But the error rate overall is very small. Once you correct, let's say it's a missing NPI in the physician database, you correct that, that reduces that. So yes, it's something definitely to be aware of.
Thank you. Karen, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, kind of going along with that. So one thing that Nebraska did that I don't think I heard on this was they kind of distilled it down so that all human prescriptions are requiring controlled and non-controlled, but all veterinary prescriptions are just still controlled. And that's kind of important to point out because that gets a little bit trickier when you have prescriptions, when you don't have NPIs for veterinarians. That really triggered a lot more errors. So I don't know, Kevin, if you can kind of say anything about that, but I think that kind of goes to what Mike's saying. There would be a lot more. I know that Nebraska gives you a dummy MPI that you can put in, but trying to manually put those in would really take a lot of manpower. So that's something that I would ask that you look at, is maybe going that route. Also, the same thing with the DEA. I don't know if there's any products that Maryland has currently where they have a state designation that is different from the federal, where you'd need a dummy DEA. But those kind of things that we might want to look at as well.
Thank you, Karen. And in the interest of time, Rebecca, I see your hand. We will get to your question. If you could either put it in the chat and we'll follow up, or we'll address it on the next call. Just to respect everyone's time, we're going to jump to the next section before we dismiss today. So we've talked quite a bit today about a lot of the issues related to the collection of non-CDS dispenses, and we are interested in working with all of y'all in that process and what that would look like. And we would like to ask the work group to consider participating in a pilot to help us in the state designated exchange work to understand what are these concerns and technical issues in further detail, and to scope out the expanse of the data that could be collected. So if work group members representing pharmacies on the call who are available to participate in a pilot, please follow up with me. I'll send an email out with some additional information, and we can convene a smaller group meeting to discuss the steps of the pilot itself, and that could occur in the next few weeks. All right, before we adjourn, Ben Stephan or David Sharp, do you have anything else or any final comments you would like to add?
David, why don't you, I spoke initially, why don't you send us all home happily, I hope, for the most part. Go ahead, David.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. And Anna, appreciate the facilitation invitation to talk. So as you all can see, there's a lot of interest in what we're doing here. I think we started out with about 50 plus, and we're now down to 45 on the call today. We're very hopeful, as Anna noted, that some of the chains and some of the small pharmacies will want to have some participation with us outside of the next meeting to talk a little bit about the opportunities for doing some pilot testing. This approach will allow us to ferret out lots more issues related to the technology and some of those related to policy. I believe one of the questions was around veterinarian medication reporting. I think that one seems on the surface very easy because we're more looking at patient-specific information for care coordination and treatment. So those are the kinds of questions that will help us know how to create more of an information sheet, if you will, for what are the technical requirements as well as the policy. So we look forward to working with you all more as we go forward into the future, and hopefully you're as interested as we are as making this work and work well in Maryland. So Anna, back to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone on the call for joining in. We about flexibility and reporting, looking to Nebraska for, thank you, Kevin, for all of the input you had. It's a communication to all of you is incredibly important. The timeliness of the data is important. And then there are quite a few other aspects to continue to consider on future work group calls. So our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for November 2nd at the same time. I hope this worked for you. We will get back to you, but please put a hold on this date. The meeting may depend on how well the pilot goes and how well we can kick off the pilot, so we make sure we have a full agenda for the next call. But I see that we are at time, and I just want to thank you all for joining today's call, and we really appreciate your input.